Okay. Hey.
Millionaire returns to his black ex-wife's home after 10 years. What he finds changes everything. A silver Tesla Model S pulls up to a forgotten dirt road in rural Alabama, but the tech billionaire behind the wheel isn't there to invest in the community, he's there to rescue the woman he erased from his success story a decade ago. 10 years ago, Daniel Carter made a choice. Pressured by venture capitalists who warned that his wife's unsophisticated background would damage the brand and scare away institutional investors, he walked away, leaving nothing but divorce papers and a severance check on their kitchen counter. He relocated to Silicon Valley, built a tech empire, and lived a life of calculated image management, convinced that Naomi was still the struggling ex-wife, raising their children in a rundown house, barely scraping by on the settlement he deemed generous. Now, Daniel has returned to Alabama, rehearsing a script of performative humility and philanthropic initiatives. He navigates the final stretch of rural highway, expecting poverty and gratitude. Instead, he sees something that fractures his narrative: solar panel arrays, fiber optic infrastructure, and a modern facility bearing a gleaming sign that reads, Williams Technology Cooperative and Innovation Hub, founded 2016. When the door opens, he doesn't find a struggling single mother, he finds a poised, self-assured woman flanked by two confident children who look at him like a stranger. Naomi isn't surprised to see him, she's been preparing for this confrontation for exactly 3,652 days. Not for closure, but for consequences. The apartment had been cramped, but they'd called it their laboratory. Daniel remembered the way Naomi's handwriting filled those spiral notebooks, elegant loops and precise notations that mapped out recursive algorithms he couldn't quite grasp until she explained them at 3 a.m., her pregnant belly pressed against the edge of their second-hand desk. She'd developed the core pattern recognition system while he'd handled the user interface. Equal partners. That's what they'd told each other. The venture capitalists had arrived on a Tuesday. 3 men in identical navy suits who sat in a coffee shop downstairs and delivered their terms with the casualness of ordering lattes. $50 million. Series of funding. National expansion. But first, some housekeeping. Your cap table is messy, the lead investor had said, not even looking at Naomi's name on the incorporation documents. Spouse as co-founder creates complications. Optics issues. Future divorce risk, no offense, means investor exposure. Clean it up, and we'll wire the money by Friday. Daniel had gone home that night and stared at those notebooks. Naomi was 8 months pregnant, her feet swollen, her back aching from hours at the computer. She'd smiled at him, exhausted but proud. We did it, baby. We actually did it. He'd nodded. Kissed her forehead. And made a choice. The divorce papers came first, framed as a strategic restructuring. The lawyers called it a spousal buyout, $75,000, and a release of all intellectual property claims. Naomi had been too exhausted, too betrayed, too focused on the twins she'd deliver 3 weeks later to fight. She'd signed because she had no lawyer, no leverage, and no idea that those notebooks would eventually be worth $4 billion. Daniel told himself it was business. That he'd take care of her later. That success would justify everything. He'd been telling himself that lie for exactly 3,652 days. The children appeared before Naomi did. Daniel stood in the foyer, documentary cameras hovering behind him, when 2 9-year-olds walked past carrying laptops like textbooks. The girl, Maya, he would learn, wore a t-shirt that read, "Code like a girl," in binary. The boy, Caleb, had headphones around his neck and moved with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who'd never been told he didn't belong in tech spaces. Mom, the training model keeps overfitting, Maya called toward the kitchen, not even glancing at the stranger in her home. I adjusted the dropout rate, but... Did you try regularization? Caleb interrupted, setting his laptop on the kitchen table and opening what Daniel immediately recognized as a Jupyter notebook. Real code. Not educational games. Actual machine learning architecture. Obviously, Maya shot back, pulling up a chair beside her brother. I'm not stupid. But look at the validation loss curve, it's diverging after epoch 12. Daniel stood frozen. These were his children. Twins he'd never met, never held, never taught. And they were debugging neural networks at the breakfast table like other kids did multiplication homework. Naomi appeared in the doorway, watching him process this reality with an expression that revealed nothing. They taught themselves Python at 6, she said quietly. By 7, they were contributing to open-source projects. By 8, they'd published a paper on bias detection in facial recognition systems, under my last name, of course, since yours would have complicated things. Caleb finally looked up, studying Daniel with clinical interest. You're the documentary guy. His tone suggested he was categorizing Daniel alongside other minor inconveniences. Mom said you'd probably come eventually. She's been ready since we were born. Maya didn't even pause her typing. Are you staying long? Because we have a presentation at the Innovation Hub at 2. Daniel had expected tears, questions, maybe resentment. Instead, he was facing two children who'd been raised in his absence to be everything he'd claimed to value, brilliant, independent, unburdened by his legacy. They didn't need him. They never had. Naomi smiled. Shall we talk in my office? The Innovation Hub occupied what had once been an abandoned textile factory. Naomi led Daniel through sliding glass doors into a space that looked like a museum designed by engineers. Polished concrete floors. Track lighting illuminating display cases. And plaques. So many plaques. I call this, the real founders, Naomi said, her voice carrying the tone of a docent who'd given this tour many times. A living archive of intellectual property theft in the technology sector. The first display case contained a handwritten notebook dated 2014. Daniel recognized Naomi's handwriting immediately, the same loops and annotations he'd watched her create in their apartment. Beside it, a notarized affidavit, a blockchain timestamp certificate, and a photograph of the original Git repository commits. All bearing her name. All predating the company's official founding by 6 months. Section 2 documents the engineers you discarded, Naomi continued, moving to the next exhibit. 3 portraits hung on the wall, faces Daniel vaguely remembered from early team meetings. Beneath each photograph, original code samples, employment contracts showing inadequate equity compensation, and legal settlements from wrongful termination suits. They were too expensive once you got your Series B. You replaced them with younger, cheaper developers and made them sign NDAs to get their severance. Daniel's throat tightened. This is documented? Yes. Naomi stopped at a central display, larger than the others. A glass case contained her original algorithms, his company's patent filings with suspiciously similar language, and a timeline showing how each of her innovations had been rebranded under his company's name within months of their divorce. Everything here is admissible in court, she said. Time-stamped, notarized, and corroborated by third-party witnesses. I've spent 10 years building this archive. Not for revenge, Daniel. For precedent. The documentary cameras captured everything. Daniel realized with creeping horror that this wasn't an ambush, it was a public record. His origin story, corrected. His genius, revealed as theft. And Naomi had turned it into an educational exhibit that would outlive them both. The 3 engineers entered exactly at noon. Daniel recognized Marcus Chen immediately, the machine learning specialist he'd hired in 2017 and laid off in 2019 when he'd questioned the company's compensation structure. Beside him stood Jennifer Park and DeAndre Johnson, both senior developers who'd left under circumstances Daniel's lawyers had called mutual separations. Mr. Carter, Marcus said, his tone professionally cold. It's been a while. They weren't here for a reunion. Each carried identical leather portfolios, and as they spread documents across Naomi's conference table, Daniel saw his past reformatted as evidence. Employment contracts with equity clauses that had never vested. Email chains where he'd personally approved below-market salaries while his own compensation tripled. Slack messages discussing how to phase out expensive engineers before their stock options matured. "You made us sign NDAs," Jennifer said, opening a laptop. "But NDAs don't cover illegal activity. Wage theft, breach of contract, and systematic discrimination aren't protected by confidentiality agreements." DeAndre pulled up a spreadsheet. "We've documented 27 engineers you hired between 2016 and 2023. Average tenure, 18 months. Average equity vested, 0.3%. You structured the vesting schedule so that most people left or were pushed out before their stock was worth anything. That's standard for startups," Daniel started. "It's systematic exploitation," Marcus interrupted. "And we have the internal memos where you and your board discussed this as strategy. Hire hungry, fire before vesting was the exact phrase you used in a 2018 board meeting." Naomi stood at the head of the table, arms crossed. "They're not here as witnesses, Daniel. They're here as co-plaintiffs. And as equity partners in the Williams Technology Cooperative. Every engineer you discarded found a home here. And they brought their documentation with them. The documentary cameras recorded everything." Daniel's redemption narrative was collapsing in real time, replaced by a class action lawsuit he'd never seen coming. These weren't victims. They were prosecutors. And Naomi had been building her case since the day he'd handed her those divorce papers. Naomi pulled out a laptop that looked older than her children. The plastic casing was cracked, the keyboard worn smooth from years of use. "Do you remember this?" she asked, her voice steady. "Our first computer. The one you told the TechCrunch reporter you'd salvaged from a dumpster to build your prototype." She opened it. The screen flickered to life, revealing a directory structure Daniel hadn't seen in a decade. "I never wiped it. Seemed wasteful. Plus, I had a feeling I'd need it someday." With a few keystrokes, she navigated to a folder marked NW_algorithms_2014. Dozens of Python files. Jupyter notebooks. Test data. Every file had a creation date and a commit history. Every commit had a username, Naomi_Williams. "This is the pattern recognition algorithm that became the foundation of your entire platform," Naomi said, her tone clinical. "The one that made your series possible. The one currently generating $400 million in annual revenue. I wrote it over 6 months while you were working your day job. You integrated it. You marketed it. But I created it." She pulled up a split screen. On the left, her original code from 2014. On the right, the company's GitHub repository from 2016, after the divorce. The code was nearly identical, same variable names, same comments, same structural logic. Only the file headers had changed, now crediting Daniel as the sole author. "Alabama is a community property state," Naomi continued, opening another folder. "Any intellectual property created during a marriage is jointly owned unless explicitly contracted otherwise. You filed for divorce in 2015, but these algorithms were created in 2014, while we were still married. I never signed away my IP rights, only my equity stake." She placed a marriage certificate and divorce decree side by side. "My lawyer, a very good lawyer, by the way, explained that the divorce settlement didn't include language about intellectual property. You bought out my ownership stake, Daniel. You didn't buy my algorithms." Daniel's hands shook. "The statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing infringement," Naomi finished. "Every time your company uses my code, it's a new violation. And you've been violating it for 3,652 days." The door opened at 1:47 p.m., and Daniel knew immediately that whoever entered next would end his career. The woman was tall, black, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that suggested she'd argued before the Supreme Court, and won. She carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy with consequence. Simone Baptiste, she introduced herself, extending a hand Daniel was too stunned to shake. Electronic Frontier Foundation, Intellectual Property Justice Division. I've been working with Naomi for 7 years on this case. She set the briefcase on the table and extracted a document so thick it made a sound when it landed. This is a 347-page complaint that will be filed simultaneously in 3 federal courts at precisely 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Northern District of California for your corporate headquarters, Middle District of Alabama for Mrs. Williams' residence and business location, and the District of Delaware where your company is incorporated. Daniel stared at the document. His name appeared on the cover sheet as defendant number 1. We're not just suing you, Mr. Carter, Simone continued, opening the briefcase again. We're challenging the entire venture capital model that incentivizes founder erasure. Your case is simply the clearest example of a systemic problem, investors who pressure founders to remove co-creators who don't fit the preferred narrative. Usually women. Disproportionately women of color. She placed another stack of papers beside the first. These are affidavits from 14 other engineers whose contributions were minimized or erased by your company and others like it. Precedent-setting cases. We're arguing that intellectual property rights in community property states supersede both divorce settlements and subsequent corporate equity structures. You can't, Daniel started. We can, and we have extensive documentation proving we should. Simone's expression didn't change. Mrs. Williams has the original source code, time-stamped and notarized. She has Git commit histories. She has your company's patent filings that use her exact language. She has a marriage certificate that legally entitles her to co-ownership of anything created during your union. She checked her watch. You have 1 hour and 13 minutes before this becomes public. I'd suggest calling your board of directors. At 2:47 p.m., Daniel's phone began vibrating. He'd been staring at it for 13 minutes, watching his carefully constructed empire prepare to collapse. The first call came from his general counsel. He declined it. The second came from his board chair. He declined that too. At 2:52 p.m., Naomi stood and gestured toward the wall-mounted television. You'll want to see this. The screen split into 4 feeds. Top left, the steps of a federal courthouse in San Francisco, where reporters were gathering. Top right, a CNBC anchor discussing breaking news in the tech sector. Bottom left, the SEC's website, refreshing every few seconds. Bottom right, his company's stock ticker, still trading at $127 per share. At 2:58 p.m., Simone Baptiste received a phone call, listened for exactly 8 seconds, and nodded to Naomi. We're confirmed. All 3 courts. At 3 p.m., the world shifted. The courthouse feed erupted as Simone's legal team emerged with documents raised high. The CNBC anchor began reading from a teleprompter about explosive allegations of IP theft by tech billionaire Daniel Carter. The SEC website updated with a notice of investigation. And Daniel's stock price began to drop. $127 became $119 in 30 seconds. $119 became $103 in the next minute. By 3:04 p.m., trading was halted pending clarification. Daniel's phone lit up with calls he couldn't answer. Text messages scrolled past faster than he could read them. Board members. Investors. The PR firm. His ex-wife's lawyer, ironically. Every notification was a small detonation in the demolition of his reputation. At 3:07 p.m., his general counsel broke through with a text in all caps, emergency board meeting. Now. Do not speak to press. By 3:15 p.m., major news outlets had picked up the story. Tech billionaire accused of stealing ex-wife's algorithms. Venture capital's founder erasure problem goes public. The woman behind the code, how Naomi Williams built the tech empire that erased her. Naomi stood beside the television, arms crossed, watching Daniel's world unmake itself in real time. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even angry. She was simply present for the reckoning she'd architected with the same precision he'd once praised in her code. "It's 3:17, she said quietly. "Your company just lost $2.4 billion in market capitalization. By tomorrow, you'll lose the rest." The conference room had emptied. The lawyers, the engineers, even the documentary crew had left. It was just Daniel and Naomi now, sitting across from each other in the space where his narrative had been systematically dismantled. "You want to know how I did this," Naomi said. It wasn't a question. "How a woman you left with $75,000 and 2 newborns built all of this." She gestured at the innovation hub, visible through the glass walls of her office. "I used your playbook," she continued. "The divorce settlement you offered. I invested every penny in a legal fund. Then I started watching. Every company that underpaid engineers, every startup that exploited their workforce, every tech giant that valued rapid growth over fair compensation. I documented everything. Filed complaints. Built cases. And I won." She pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. "Your company paid out $4.7 million in settlements between 2017 and 2024 for various labor violations. Most of those cases. I was the consulting expert. The lawyer on the other side. The anonymous whistleblower who provided documentation." Daniel stared at the numbers. Settlement after settlement. All paid from his company's legal defense fund. All funneled back to the woman he tried to erase. "I didn't just survive, Daniel. I used your money to build an alternative model. Every settlement paid for another engineer's salary at the cooperative. Every legal victory funded another scholarship, another training program, another challenge to the system you represent." She closed the laptop. "You asked me to sign away my intellectual property rights for $75,000. That was 2015. Since then, I've extracted $4.7 million from your company in various legal settlements. I've used that money to train 47 engineers who now work in the cooperative. I've established a legal precedent that 17 other plaintiffs have used to reclaim credit for their stolen work." Naomi stood, looking out at the innovation hub where engineers, many of them women, many of them people of color, worked at standing desks in a space built on accountability. "You didn't abandon me, Daniel. You created me. Every choice you made to prioritize profit over people, every engineer you discarded, every contribution you erased, you built your own opposition. And I've had 10 years to make it bulletproof." 6 months later, Daniel Carter stood in his one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, a far cry from his former Pacific Heights penthouse. The apartment smelled like reheated takeout and legal documents. He owned 8.3% of the company he'd founded, a minority stake that gave him no board seat and no operational control. The rest had been redistributed, 23% to Naomi Williams as co-founder, 31% to the employee equity trust that Simone Baptiste had negotiated, and the remainder to investors who'd survived the restructuring. His phone buzzed with a New York Times alert. He opened it reflexively, a habit from when he paid a firm to track his media mentions. The headline read, "Williams Technology Cooperative expands to third state, trains 200th engineer." The article included a photograph. Naomi stood at a podium in what appeared to be a congressional hearing room, flanked by Caleb and Maya. The caption identified her as civil rights attorney and technology co-founder Naomi Williams, testifying before the House Committee on Small Business about equitable ownership structures in the technology sector. Daniel read the article despite himself. The cooperative had established training programs in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. It operated on a profit-sharing model where engineers owned equity from day one. It had become a case study at Stanford Business School, the institution that had once invited Daniel as a guest speaker and now taught his failures as cautionary tales. There was a smaller photograph embedded in the article. Caleb and Maya, now 10 years old, standing beside their mother. They'd published a second paper on algorithmic bias, this time in a peer-reviewed journal. They'd given a TED talk about children in technology. They'd built their entire childhood in the space Daniel's absence had created, and they'd thrived. His doorbell rang. A process server with more legal documents, probably. Or maybe journalists who'd finally tracked down his new address. Daniel didn't answer. He sat in his subsidized apartment, watching the world celebrate the woman he tried to diminish, and understood that this was exactly the legacy he'd earned. Not the Forbes covers or TechCrunch profiles. Not the innovation awards or keynote speeches. But this, a man who'd built an empire on erasure and lost everything to the truth he tried to bury. Naomi Williams was testifying before Congress. Her children were changing the world. And Daniel Carter was learning, far too late, the difference between taking credit and earning legacy.